This is Dan Fagella. You're tuned in to The Trajectory. This is the first episode in our AGI Governance series, and our first guest is Sebastien Krier. Sebastien began his career studying law at King's College. He went on to head regulation for the Office of Artificial Intelligence for the UK, and now works in regulatory policy at Google DeepMind. He's also awfully fun to follow on Twitter. This series on AGI governance will cover 4 core questions. First, how important is AGI governance now? Every one of our interviewees has a very different answer for that, by the way. Number 2, what should be its purpose? Number 3, what would it look like in practice? And number 4, what could innovators and regulators get done to get the ball rolling now? Seb has some very particular takes on these questions, including not so much immediate governance, but more keeping a finger on the pulse, specifically around capabilities, alignment, and misuse. We define those terms and talk about Sebastian's perspective on what it would look like to keep tabs on the things that matter as this technology becomes vastly more powerful, and what kind of levers we might want to pull as we cross those different thresholds of capability. Without further ado, hope you enjoy this episode with Sebastien of DeepMind here on The Trajectory. So Seb, welcome to The Trajectory.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Great to be able to catch up outside of the Twitter context and be able to have a little bit of a longer venue of discourse with you here today. There's a lot to dive into, and you've done a great job of organizing your thoughts ahead of the interview, so we'll run along that outline on some level. But question number 1 for everybody in the series on sort of AGI governance is really, how important of a global priority is it now? You know, I think most people would agree we don't have AGI yet. Some people think it's going to be soon. Some people are a little bit more hand-wavy about it than others. Where do you stand in that regard, and why?
Right. Yeah, I think it's a really tricky question because it kind of depends partly on what exactly do you mean by AGI and what do we mean by governance and what exactly do you mean by now. But broadly, I think, I can give you a mix of thoughts as to how I think about this. So, I think for some crowds, I do think it's, important to make it clear that, AGI is a technology that, many labs are kind of trying to build, and that is something that is, plausible and certainly realistic in the coming years. And so I think I do want, more people to kind of be aware of this dynamic and kind of to take this into account when they think about the future and what they're working on and so on. But having said that, I also think that, in terms of global governance specifically, I kind of think we're still in a research and monitoring phase for now, still mostly. And I think, part of the intuition here is that I was working in kind of AI policy in 2017, 18 onwards. And it's kind of impressive how much over time we got wrong, essentially, and how much, my own kind of model of what's going on, what's desirable, what's not desirable, has been kind of gradually shifting as you got better kind of, evidence or better models or, better kind of, or interesting developments that I couldn't have foresaw. And so I'll give you a few, examples, but a very basic one is when I was in government, we were working on a guide for using AI in the public sector. And I remember this, saying something like, one thing that is certain is that AI cannot be creative. And, in retrospect, I'd argue that this, couldn't be more wrong, although I know that others right now would argue against me. Yeah. And I think similarly, there's the AI Act itself has kind of changed quite a lot over time. And I can see a lot of questions being still unanswered in how the legislation will be applied, the specific standards, what kind of practices or technical mitigations we want to kind of cement or codify into a code of practice. And so I just think we also, figuring out how to think about language models and what they are. I think the general kind of understanding of models tends to be very kind of over-indexed on chatbots or, certain types of UIs, but I think we're still kind of developing a lot of the heuristics and the knowledge to really better kind of test them, scrutinize them, and understand them. And so with this in mind, and with the fact that I think, there's still quite a lot, I think, for us to work out, I do think that a kind of incremental approach makes sense. And as a side point, also in terms of, global governance specifically. So, I used to practice public international law and international arbitration in a past career as a lawyer. And I think in policy or in academia, sometimes people kind of, overestimate the effectiveness of the global ecosystem we have in terms of law institutions. So, for example, I think international organizations, they've been doing a lot of great work. I've been, a huge fan of multilateralism and so on for a long time. But I think a lot of these are also increasingly ossifying over time, getting a bit more decayed, a bit more dysfunctional. And so I think that decision making in these four is incredibly complicated and full of difficult trade-offs that relate to foreign policy and many other kind of areas. And so essentially, effectiveness is sometimes a bit tricky. And same with international law. People sometimes assume that this is the same as national law, just at a higher level, but in reality, it's very hard to enforce. There are no or very few central authorities. State sovereignty remains essentially the norm, and a lot of economic and military power dynamics tend to be prioritized. And so often actually what people understand as international law is partly also just state practice that ends up being codified. And basically, my sense is, I think there's a lot that we can and could be doing at this stage, but I still think we're more in a kind of research. I think Yoshua Bengio's work with the kind of international reports on where AI is heading and state of the science and safety. So I think this is the kind of thing we need more of, and more updates on that over time. But I do think that what isn't a priority in my mind is to kind of rush and create yet another global institution very quickly that I think wouldn't show that many promising results at this stage.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack here between what you're diving into. So you mentioned sort of the supposition that this is simple at an international level. I mean, it almost certainly isn't. And I could see that as an argument for why we ought not think about it now, because these are really clunky gears that we'd have to turn to try to make any of this work. I could also see that as somebody's argument for why we might want to start thinking about it now, because by golly, who knows how long it's going to take to get there. Like, well, let's just wait until the sand god is born. It's like, it's going to move a little bit faster than the international policy world is. So I could almost see that like sitting on both sides of the fence here. And similarly, we had Dileep George on less than a year ago here on The Trajectory. He kind of talked about setting the laws for air flight when we had Zeppelins would have been a very silly and strange thing to do. There's very different ways to park those kinds of vehicles, very different, you still want to avoid crashes, right? There's meta categories of disasters you want to avoid, but certainly how those manifest is very, very different. And even with LLMs, it seems like ossifying some of those rules around LLMs would be sort of silly. But then again, and I'd love your thoughts on this, when the next paradigm occurs, let's just say it's in a year and a half, or let's say it's in 3 years. It really doesn't matter if it's 7, to be honest. But let's just say the next paradigm occurs beyond LLMs, astronomically more capable. Maybe it's drawn from physical embodiment. These things will have access to hundreds of thousands of robots, small and large, whatever the case may be. Big shift in terms of what general intelligence and agency looks like, and everybody can see it. Everybody can agree. We could presume after that one, there's going to be another one. And so is the idea maybe we'd want to start to close the gates a little bit more on what governance could look like when we see a shift that seems like it's 1 or 2 door knocks away from being outlandishly more powerful than people? Or how do you see that there? Because I think Dileep has a great point about Zeppelins. And then again, it's like there probably is a too late as well. And would love to get your thoughts on that, just high level.
Yeah, I think just very quickly on the kind of international institution side of things, I do think it is the right time to start thinking about it, which is why I was kind of emphasizing the whole research and monitoring and kind of developing ideas side.
Yes.
So we did publish kind of last year also this paper on international institutions for AI governance and so on. And, I had all these discussions around, should it be a CERN for AI and IAEA for AI and so on. So I definitely think it's the right time to kind of explore these ideas and look at things like how do you improve institutional decision-making and institutional reform and so on. What I was kind of cautioning against was just, let's launch just another institution straight away with no clear mandate and then try to work out projects. On the second question, I think the kind of Zeppelin analogy or example is an interesting one. And, I've been thinking a little bit about it in like, your pre-internet days, you're kind of, starting out with the internet, and people are kind of thinking about privacy and they're thinking it through privacy. Well, that seems important and that could be a thing. But, you don't know about cookies. You don't know about kind of people's, habits, browsing habits. People didn't even think that people would have individual kind of computers at home, right? So it would have been very difficult at this stage to make kind of much conceptual progress on designing a specific, GDPR-like law. But it was the right time to maybe start thinking about, potential implications, how things might go wrong, what do you do about it, preparing the kind of, I guess, intellectual infrastructure or something for that work. And so when I think about AI and AGI and so on, right now, I don't know how much progress I could make if I were to think about flying robots or something. I could think about it, I could make some sort of kind of, but how useful would that really be right now? Whereas I can make a lot more progress on the frontier of the systems we have today and kind of seeing where they're going and kind of preempting some capabilities, in incremental steps and thinking through, okay, well, it seems like maybe agents seem to be an interesting and useful paradigm that people are looking into. I don't see a lot of agents right now doing really interesting, work or performing as well as I would have wanted them to, but I can imagine that in a year or two, you'll see more of that. And there's something I can already do now that will be useful in that sense. But, again, thinking through 5 or 10 years later, thinking about AGI specific, there's much you can do now, I think. And I think much that can be done now. I just sometimes would be careful with not over-indexing or, just being overly confident, I think, with what legal instruments today can do about things that, come up in 10 years, 5 years.
Yeah. And we'll get a little bit more into kind of what you think we should be happening for capabilities now. But I think, it feels like, and I've asked the people in the series sort of, 1 to 10, a 10 being, oh my goodness, it should have been yesterday. We should have some sort of a grand global mandate already in place. And then a 1 is like, this is as relevant as a global mandate for, how to cook s'mores or, whatever the case may be, right? It's just completely irrelevant. Sounds like, I'm not going to put the words in your mouth. I'll ask you, but it feels like 3-ish. Like we should be thinking about it. We should be looking at things. We should be having open-ended discussions about what this looks like. But we shouldn't be blowing our way into governance as of now. I mean, but you let me know where you'd like to frame your sitting.
I think I would have gone higher than 3. I would have gone 5 or potentially even 6. In that I think, again, the work, Bengio's doing, I think is necessary and useful in the right time for it. And I think that, the work we're doing in terms of high level discussions, there's, track to dialogue, there's a bunch of stuff happening. I think that, is right. We're doing the right thing at the right time. What I would be more skeptical of is if, someone said, oh, that's it right now. We need to bring all the labs together and create some sort of big CERN for AI tomorrow.
Yeah.
Or or right now we need to write up a whole plan for what the kind of inspections regime for kind of compute cluster, it's that seems that potentially relevant themes or topics in at some point, but not now. And so that's kind of what I'm I guess referring to. But certainly I think that, you need more international discussions and certainly, a lot of, I'm in my bubble here at, DeepMind or, in kind of the UK or in the US, but a lot of the world doesn't exactly see it the same way. And I think broadening that can be also done through international fora. And there's a lot to be done. I just, it's the magnitude or the scale or the intensity of the action that I'm sometimes concerned with.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of credence to that point. So, okay. So that's a good update manually to sort of where you would score things. And clearly monitoring and kind of capabilities, research and updates, very important for you. I think important for everybody following the trajectory of intelligence broadly. What are some of those things that, in the very near term that you see as priorities, sort of before any kind of organization is built? Right. You'd want to see hopefully more focus on X or Y or Z. Maybe it's, how capable these agents are, how dangerous they are at contriving biological weapons. Different people have different ideas about this stuff. But for you, when it comes to the capabilities you'd want to sort of stay close to sort of get a sense of where are we risk-wise, what are those things and what do you hope to see more of?
Yeah, I think what I found kind of helpful in the last year is that, things like responsible scaling policies or frontier safety frameworks, or preparedness frameworks, depending on how you want to call them, have kind of forced people to just think through what are the threat models, what are the things we're concerned with, and then, working backwards from that in terms of what evaluation do we want to build. So we've put out a lot of work on dangerous capabilities, at DeepMind. There's some interesting papers out there looking at, CBRN, self-replication, persuasion, autonomy, and so on. I think all of these are worth exploring and looking into more kind of detail. But I guess the one that does come to mind sometimes to me is machine learning automation. I guess again, if you're going to automate the entire ML research and R&D pipeline, I'm not sure how that kind of, again, I think we're fairly far from that, but I think it's important to kind of specify exactly what we mean there and what, I can evaluate for that. But I think generally, on the safety side and capabilities, I think I'm happy there's more work going into defining what dangerous capabilities are like, or could be like. And secondly, linking them to wider threat models, right? So for a model to be persuasive, or for a model to tell me a particular type of information is one thing, but that's not sufficient to me to make a determination about risk. I still need to know, okay, what would a malicious actor need to do and use in order to cause harm? is that capability critical to that, or can they easily find an alternative elsewhere, so on and so forth. And I think more work on this kind of stuff, both the kind of understanding the capabilities, evaluating for them, but linking that to kind of stuff we're actually worried with, makes sense. And then, maturing, I guess, the science of designing evaluations, frontier safety frameworks, all these things. And I guess on a side point, I'm also interested in things like, sentience, consciousness, these types of questions I find interesting. Again, very early as well, but I think, my prediction is that we're not going to have some sort of point where we're like, oh, this is how you define it. And so, I just think it's an interesting one to look into as we get into this world in the next, I don't know how many years.
You've talked roughly here about sentience, which I would tend to concur with you, I think is at least morally consequential. Some people think it's, it's funny. The sentience question is a real funny one, Seb, because, I'll have people on here like a Jeff Hawkins or a Richard Sutton who will essentially flippantly state that of course it will be conscious in a way whereby it would be ridiculous to question if any permutation of AGI ever couldn't be conscious. And there are others with just as high a repute who will state with a cold frankness and certainty that of course it wouldn't. And then there are others like Bengio who are like, no idea, who have no clue, right? So I think the conscious question, frankly, does feel like a real one. You also mentioned kind of AI's ability to improve itself and sort of run the AI process. It's sort of like recursive improvement feels like something to monitor, and then also just malicious use. It feels like those are categories that for you are like, we should keep a pulse on those elements. Is that a correct supposition?
Yeah, I think so. I think, there's of course the wider alignment problem, but
we'll get a little into that as well. We'll get into that today too. I think that one's going to be a fun one to unpack. Final little quick thing. We're going a little long on this first one, but I want to kind of nutshell some of this. I think many folks that I've talked to would have a similar stance that you do, where we really should keep our finger on the pulse here, and at the same time not really jump into wild and wacky, international laws or governance as of right now. But at some point, it feels like that ought happen. You and I can't know exactly what that's going to look like. When the next paradigm happens, who knows? Maybe LLMs by themselves get us astronomically farther than we would have thought. We're certainly going to have the compute for it. The data center world is going to be printing some cash in the next decade here. And if by no other means, we've got that way of getting there. However we get there, what is a line that if we crossed it, you might say, geez, some of the discourse around making this more real should be possible? Is there an element of those risks you talked about, or an element of self-improvement you talked about, where if this capability were to just be the case, I would say we should more squarely be thinking about how to have some kind of international concord around this and even solidify that into law? Like, what would be some of those magic lines if we could imagine some of them?
Yeah, it's pretty, it's a tough question, because I haven't often thought of, here's the thing that would make me go, let's say we need an international kind of, and I would have hoped that, before we get that thing, I would have kind of preempted a little bit, or at least we need a better place than just like, so I think there's, first of all, there's this kind of frontier safety framework I mentioned. And so all the stuff in there and the kind of misuse and dangerous capabilities I mentioned, each individually, as you get better on these metrics, and as the models get better on these metrics, help me kind of update over time, or at least if I see them just getting better on every month, and then, in a year or so, we're able to fully pass our cyber evals, then of course, I need to kind of update my world model. And well, actually, I do expect them to get better, so it wouldn't be a huge update. But I think at these points, you start, thinking through, okay, well, now what we do, this is possible, it's not fully deployed yet. We have these kind of mitigations and protections we preempted, but what else does that mean for society as a whole, for preparedness, for DEFAC and all that? But I think, in terms of other specific capabilities, AGI capabilities that would warrant some sort of global governance regime, I imagine it's a mix of, really strong long-term reasoning, with models kind of coming up with really intricate details, new knowledge and plans and kind of creations that you can autonomously just leave the thing running for a few hours, and you've got, in the space of a few hours, work that you would normally take in kind of much longer. Some strong degree of embodiment probably makes sense. Better understanding of how, I guess, models and AI fits in the science and R&D pipeline. The more and more, again, I would observe, seeing a bunch of models together come up with some sort of new invention just independently. Just why I'm doing some sort of multi-agent simulation thing. That these kinds of things all have a weird, feeling of, things are moving very fast.
My supposition here, Seb, I hate to say it, my supposition is if all of those things happened and none of them were accompanied by a particular disaster, the frog would boil. In other words, because if you could go back 15 years, right, and say what we have today, I think people would the bells would start ringing. My supposition is either the system itself or a human marshaling the system against another group of humans marshaling the system. One of those two things will cause some kind of a large enough spook factor where the everyman, as well as the policy and research folks, could point at that and say, whoa, the risks are actually real. Like, I actually think the things that you articulated all seem plausible, and I would tend to agree. But my guess is, without a catalyst with a little negative oomph behind it, we could have a maid in the other room making me a sandwich, and teaching me multiple languages and building a new roof. Yeah. And I'd be like, yeah, but I don't know, that's normal stuff, right? And building new landing pages and e-commerce funnels or something for me on the side, right? And I'd just be like, everybody has one now. I mean, this isn't really a big deal. This isn't like Kardashev type stuff, so.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. So, I'm thinking, so firstly, you're right. I think by seeing these kind of very advanced capabilities, people can also imagine them, being misused or going wrong, but that's sometimes not enough. And, you may have at some point one day, some malicious actor misusing a model in a way that kind of causes some, harm to some sort of cybersecurity breach or something that kind of wakes people up. Sometimes you do it's like COVID, right? Pandemic preparedness, it only comes after, COVID.
Of course.
So I think this is a risk and something I'm concerned with, and which is I'm very happy. This is why I'm happy that there's so many more people working on kind of governance, safety, all this stuff right now with AI. Far more, I suspect, than I would have expected 5 years ago when you told me about this stuff. And there's maybe 20 people kind of thinking about the governance policy side. And it's also, I do also, on the more optimistic side, I think people and political organizations, studies, they do also kind of update in some sort of indirect, implicit ways. I remember in 2018, I was thinking and talking to people in government about persuasion and manipulation for models. And they're like, you're completely insane. What are you talking about? And I was like, well, yes, sure, not right now. But, and then I was a little bit worried about, okay, well, no one seems to be taking this seriously. And then a couple of years later, you had the diplomacy game that, I think it was Meta and DeepMind also did some work that demonstrated, what was meant by a system kind of deceiving a user. And I was like, well, there you go. This is the thing I meant. And of course, then it made a bit more sense, and people kind of internalized gradually over time that, okay, persuasion is potentially a risk here. Now we've got a bunch of papers on this stuff. Again, do I think that now we're not doing enough on persuasion? I'm not sure. I'm not sure right now we've had any huge mass persuasion campaign thing that, I think things like the actual threat models are more complicated than the micro kind of capability and evaluation. But, we're certainly more aware and more interested in looking and exploring these things and open to kind of potentially regulate it. In fact, the AI Act does look at some of these things. And so there's also reason for some optimism without necessarily waiting for some sort of large event to happen to get people, to wake up.
Yeah, fingers crossed, brother. Fingers crossed. I think there's many people literally 2 days before the diplomacy game was completely conquered, where someone would have said, well, okay, we'll go makes sense. I get it. But diplomacy, if it starts trouncing us there, that we got real right? But then it trounces us. And I think people look to the right and they look to the left and they say, is anything going wrong? And if the answer is no, then they just keep doing what they're doing. I think this is just straight up hominid normal stuff here, man. I think this is how we operate. With that said, let me get into our next question here around sort of the purpose of AGI governance. You've got kind of a broad idea of what this could look like. Right now, I think this idea of monitoring and staying on top of where capabilities are makes a lot of sense. At some point, there may be, it seems quite likely, there will eventually be a shift towards, is there a way for us to downplay a pure international arms race dynamic with, let's say, China or between the major labs or whatever? Is there a way to increase our likelihood of alignment or whatever people are after? For you, for Seb, what would you hope that kind of the purpose of said body or constellation of bodies that would bring about the first kind of international AGI rules, regulations, laws with teeth, what would be the driving purpose if it sort of went as you might hope?
Well, yeah, I guess I understand the word governance quite widely, right? So it could be regulations and laws. It could also be norms and kind of
Totally.
practices,
Yeah,
behaviors,
absolutely.
beliefs.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I think for me, like, and I guess the purpose of AGI governance would be, finding the best ways for companies to kind of develop and deploy these technologies, and the best way for people to kind of use, interact, and relate to them. And I think, as that will require quite a wide range of things. I'm personally very interested in safety-related questions, but also, I think there's a sometimes underrated part of how to use the technology itself to solve some of these large problems. So, if you look at even COVID, for example, I think part of the solution here to prevent further pandemics was kind of prevention, of course, but also the development of these kind of vaccines was super critical. And so similarly, I think what are the vaccines for usual societal problems around cybersec and bio and a bunch of other kind of but yeah, broadly, I think I'm interested in kind of developing the right understanding for what AGI is, its shape, how it's deployed, how it's used, and I guess in the future, all these kind of more type of questions of cohabitation with digital minds.
Yeah,
I guess
we'll
I'm going to try to make it more concrete. I guess there's three things. The first is right now, the role of AGI governance today is to kind of ensure you have the right physical infrastructure, intellectual capital, and state capacity for when you get AGI. I think secondly is ensuring you take the safety implications quite seriously in all the necessary measures. And that's all the stuff I mentioned earlier on, safety frameworks, laws, and so on and so forth. And I guess also taking kind of national security and global policy implications quite seriously. That includes also things like civilian and democratic oversight and deployment and so on and so forth. So I think broadly right now today, I think it's kind of like preparing the institutional landscape.
I like that. The purpose of governance would be to handle those three things, sort of the hopefully the prevention of international conflict and maybe even the promotion of concord on some level. Thinking about the safety and benefit of the technology to people, and then also just being able to kind of either get there and or deal with it in the first place from kind of that infrastructure level. I think that's not a bad 1, 2, 3 of kind of what the purpose ought to be. When we get into, what, assuming we get to a place where we are thinking about some early laws, we are thinking about some, laws like maybe we have with chemical weapons, or we could think about other international sort of law correlates, right? There's a million of these, right? Sanction stuff and all kinds of tools and past precedents and potentially adjustments to them for future scenarios, whatever the case may be. The next question is sort of around like, what should that maybe look like in order to bring about those more beneficial outcomes? You talked about those three things as the purpose, like what would it look like? And you had mentioned in your notes ahead of time, and I thought these would be interesting points to unpack. In order for such governance to kind of take hold, we might need to think about the machinery of governance in a different way, and we might need to think about the process of democracy in a different way. And now that's different than a lot of the other answers I've gotten from folks that I've talked to about that question. Could we unpack those a bit in terms of what you think will have to shift when we do get to a point where this stuff has to have teeth? It's very, very clear on some level it's got to have teeth, more than just like handshakes and smiles.
Totally.
What are those considerations for you? What do you think we need to think about in terms of the machinery of government? What might need to adjust?
Yeah, I think so. So I could go in so many different directions for this.
It's
question,
a fun one, man. We can go off.
I guess So for the I suspect that, again, as you develop technology and gets better and you get better kind of deployments and use cases and so on, people will integrate the use into their lives more and more. In the same way, like a lot of people kind of ask questions to Gemini and Claude and so on kind of on end. I think you'll just have that dynamic, but at scale for many more things. And I think that that can be used as an opportunity to kind of help enhance the kind of internals, the composition of the machinery of government. So just like companies, I think a lot of tasks and potential responsibilities and, and some jobs even might be kind of partially or fully automated. And loads of kind of processes that would have been otherwise too expensive, costly, or impractical could also then be realized. And I think that, ensuring that the government is at the forefront of this technology, uses itself, and, seems quite important to me. Because if I think of, the future workforce and, Group A is people who just don't use AI at all, and Group B is people who kind of use AI in their day-to-day work, I expect Group B to do better. And I think the same applies with kind of when I think of governments and enhancing their own processes, making sure that kind of the state capacity remains quite strong. So that's the first thing. And then there's the, when I mentioned democratic processes, I think this is more complicated, of course, but I think there's ways in which, again, like, people having their individual agents or assistants could help quite a lot in many respects in getting, their views kind of better synthesized or like shared with kind of like policymakers and representatives and so on. So many kind of usual, principal agent problems and so on, I think could be thought through again with, if you had such kind of advanced capabilities in the next 5-10 years. Anyway, I think there's like interesting research on kind of the use of AI and collective decision making, things on how do you negotiate agreements better or how to optimally aggregate or deal with different preferences. And same with, I think one thing I really liked was Concordia, which is this kind of simulated platform thing that, DeepMind put out last year, open source, I think. And, you've got a lot of different kind of individual agents in there, but not in the same sense as we talked about agents earlier. But, models essentially kind of interacting, and you get to observe their interactions. You get to set, like, for example, the parameters and so on. I think essentially simulating policy outcomes and simulating different kind of interventions and so on can be a really useful tool also in the future. So, yeah, kind of mixing up the first and the second point here. But I guess the third one that I would add to this is also how governments can work together. I think collaboration, cooperation, competition, those are questions, again, that AI and AGI could help resolve and deal with complexity, deal with kind of hidden information that different parties have, verification. Yeah, broadly, these would be some of the shapes kind of thing I think are interesting to look at from a governance perspective, or at least from a public administration point of view.
Yeah, let's roll a couple of these around a little bit. So the idea of using AI to potentially simulate, policy, I think it would seem as if there would be great credence to that. We can presume some of the questions we're trying to answer. If there were simply a lot more information pulled together a lot better, maybe we'd have a lot better of a chance of making smarter decisions. That seems very plausible. At the same time, if I look at where AI is making predictions in a way that people trust it inside of the enterprise, so let's say, a big drug maker or a retail bank or something like that, the world that I mostly hang out in, a lot of these are things that we can have a full feedback loop on. We can figure out, is this transaction money laundering or is it not money laundering? We can look at huge volumes of those and we can kind of garner enough sort of feedback to sort of make a really informed decision about future transactions or what kind of transactions we might want to allow or not allow. And that's a very bounded reality. And it's a world where a lot of feedback loops can be complete. We can have humans do some digging and verify some things and figure out what's a green check mark and what's a red X. In terms of setting, the education budget in the city of Chicago, obviously a lot more variables, and it's impossible to run the universe as a simulation with one and the other. In what particular ways would you suspect AI to inform policy would be most influential? I guess my gut is telling me kind of early days, congealing, pulling together, potentially interpreting data to make suggestions for policy might be kind of step one. That's almost today's tech, though. I mean, that's not really the next wave. We don't know about the next wave. Do you have any thoughts on what that, again, might look like? That machinery of government thing was a very interesting point. I just want to try to make it a little bit visual and tactile.
Well, yeah, to be clear, I'm not saying, outsource to, Concordia or some sort of multi-agent system.
Totally.
Setting.
I wasn't hearing that, yeah.
No, of course. But I think, certainly you start off in small scale and, what you could be simulating now in coming years or something, you can even do something really micro, like, what's the effect of having a parking here versus not having a parking? And, it doesn't have to be something super consequential.
Yeah.
And I think that so there's one thing about kind of simulating, mini experiments essentially that gives you some insight and some insight that you can then use or not use as you wish in your kind of work as a policymaker. So I can, simulate particular things, do some RCTs also, and, do some kind of citizen assemblies, whatever, then with all that data, I then make a decision. So that's one thing. And I think this is where the simulations fall, right? Stuff like Concordia, the future Concordias. But on the other hand, when you mention, right now, decisions are kind of bounded. A lot of people, you've got these systems. Yeah, I'm not saying, automate everything away and then just kind of hope for the best and that things don't just gradually shift into weird directions. And I am like interested in kind of research directions like those of at ARIA, or I think even Bengio itself is looking at kind of like formal verification. But I think I'm also confident that like things like confident. I'm cautiously like optimistic around things like chain of thought, and a lot of these systems being a lot more interpretable than we initially kind of thought, and being able to kind of align them in different ways and use them in kind of bounded settings and have like clear standards and laws about where they can and cannot be used, and safeguards that are used in their use, and so on. So in highly safety critical applications, I would expect there to be enough kind of like opportunities for like human reviews and in the loop, and that might slow things down. And one could argue that over time there's be pressures towards kind of removing these humans in the loop, but and I think that's possible. But I think I think there's different questions on the simulation side, how to use such a tool in kind of making new policies or updating them, and then the second one being, if you were to automate certain functions and tasks and so on, which of these do you do? What are the risks involved? How mature is the technology, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Okay. So that's certainly more tangible, and I like your early example too. Where should every dime of the Chicago education budget go? Bigger deal. Does it make sense to put a parking lot here or here? Much more. Let's call it reasonable early sort of level of stakes we want to throw on the table kind of game. I think that makes a ton of sense. And the idea also of kind of the democratic process potentially shifting. I've heard conversations about this, not always tied to most of the democracy AI conversations these days, whether it's from a Bengio or whoever else, have to do with Gen AI and its potential, or agents and their potential to do a lot of sort of social engineering work and sort of that might shake what undergirds smart civil decision making and sort of interpretation of truth and policy and whatever else. That's where a lot of that sort of democracy AI leaning into AGI conversation goes. You're kind of talking here around, does the process itself have to adjust as we get closer to AGI? Maybe this is because you think we need to be much more nimble and move more quickly when the tech is moving more quickly. Maybe it's just because you think the current system is already so flawed. You got some ideas. Let me know sort of what you meant there and what you think might need to shift.
Well, I certainly don't. Yeah, I think all the work going on around things like synthetic information and so on, and the role of these systems and kind of wider information sharing, all that's like super important. I think what I meant here though was say for example voting, right? Like different countries have different mechanisms or ways of counting votes, and there's like different I guess methodologies one could explore here. Things like, again, this is all a little bit pie in the sky, but quadratic voting or rank preferences, this and that, and seeing, okay, are there better ways of organizing the machinery of democracy, the ways we we kind of separate powers, the way we kind of make decisions, the way we citizens provide feedback to their like local and higher representatives and so on, the way kind of laws get kind of scrutinized, all of these kind of different things that make up a healthy level of democracy. I think there will be ways in which you can use this technology to enhance and improve these as well. And so I guess what I'm thinking about is you can think of some sort of well-performing but old car, and you're gonna maybe just like try to make it run a little bit better and fix some parts of the engine, because I think many would agree that like there's stuff that you could improve in the way kind of our democracies are run. But yeah, and I think you've had some experiments, most like early studies on like using systems to help people whether conspiracy theory like beliefs or something and find agreement or thing. I just quite optimistic around the idea of a personal agent being potentially very useful in both kind of helping me liaise with my kind of wider government ecosystem, as opposed to writing a handwritten letter to my MP and hoping for a response or something.
Yeah, that there might be more fluid, transparent conversation between constituents and sort of governance and et cetera. Also, presumably, if we're talking about some degree of a participatory process for AGI governance in a global level, I don't know if every Bob, Sue, and Jacob, would be voting on every AGI international law per se, or if it would happen more at a country level. I don't know. But in either case, we might imagine that process internationally needing to be a little bit faster and maybe more nimble as well, kind of how that democratic process is updated and made more swift.
Yeah, totally. And again, I don't really know what that would kind of look like at a kind of
Yeah.
future global level and kind of but certainly AGI would be a technology with kind of quite global implications. So I think by default you would want quite a large, mass of people opining and having a say in how this is all kind of being developed and used and deployed in their own countries and economies. But and again, these tools, these deliberation mechanisms and so on could form part of these things. But again, very early stages, so hard to again say in advance.
Let me throw some ideas at you. So
Uh-huh.
when you're talking about this, it hadn't dawned on me in any kind of fleshed out mental way until you just started mentioning it. I see a world very much where, I've got agents running in the background, ordering groceries for me and filtering by cost and by nutrient density and all kinds of factors, right? Maybe I get one shipment from Stop and Shop and one shipment from Amazon Fresh and one shipment, like depending on what's optimizing for price or timing or whatever I care about. But it's like doing all that granular optimization, like all the time. Like I open up the fridge with my glasses on and it just does that. It just starts rolling and it's out there optimizing. Same thing maybe for positions I'm hiring for, custom outbound messages, be it LinkedIn or other channels or whatever the case may be. I don't know if I would do it, but I wonder if there would be a person, assuming, depending on how the balloting process goes, right? Or depending on how this new nimble AI-enabled voting shebang could go. I could see people saying, some people are single issue voters. I mean, probably if I really think about it, probably a disturbing number of people are single issue voters. But even people who aren't could maybe throw in their nuances, say, hey, look at sort of who you think is most likely to XYZ QRS based on XYZ QRS. Maybe it's a single issue. It's just like whoever is more firmly pro-abortion or something. I don't know. I'm just bringing up things Americans fight about all the time for some reason. Yeah. And just submit, like put that in for me. Like have that be my person. And or if it is our agents who are sort of helping to not only inform us on the politics of the day, but sort of shepherd our bidding to go and sort of plop ballots wherever ballots need to be plopped in this new digital future. We would also imagine that the degree of stringency placed on those machines, you could easily see people saying, well, geez, the whole way people are filling their heads is from these conversations with these sort of personalized systems, and then the actions they're taking are getting kicked out from these systems as well. Even a tiny amount of thumb on the scale from anyone that influences that grand system could very much tilt perception, polling results, whatever the case may be. What are your thoughts there? I mean, this is coming to my mind.
Yeah, again, it's very hard to kind of think through a system that doesn't, but I think, I guess the way I think about it is certainly the first thing, this dynamic might exist with or without AI in a sense, right? Like, if someone, have people who are single issue voters now, you've got people who'll be kind of incentivized to vote in a particular polarized way now and so on,
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely.
And I think the question is, how can you develop kind of agents and systems and AI and so on that also, don't kind of rob people of agency in the sense, like, I don't want to actually, for a lot of this stuff, just delegate a bunch of decisions to an agent, just does it all for me in the background, right? I want to be an active participant, and I want the agent to also, like, ensure that I can, learn more, make more informed decisions, so on and so forth. And I think actually that I'm a little bit more optimistic about kind of, humanity as a whole, like being kind of not just pure single issue voters with very simplistic kind of like self-interested, views, but I think most people actually care also about a whole lot of different policy issues. And they also care about how kind of policies and laws affect others, not just them. So I think part of this is ensuring that, first of all, in the design of these systems, that you don't just kind of essentially get people being kind of, like saying yes, no to, and the algorithm kind of just doing stuff and you're not really knowing what's going on. You're like, well, it must be for the better because I guess it knows me or something. Like that wouldn't seem to me like the best kind of world to get into.
Yeah. How do you stop that slippery slope though? Because look, I gotta be frank with you, Seb. I highly suspect almost everyone, like, Facebook came out. I'll never have a Facebook account. Online dating came out. I'll never date on the internet. What kind of a psychopath would, texting came out. Who texts? Just call somebody like a grown up, whatever, right? Like I highly suspect that many of the things that we now take, like a car, like how about taking care of a regular horse like a man and, and riding it where you need to ride it, I think I suspect that the idea of sort of how much autonomy we have over things like groceries or even other decisions, if the general output is it's less thinking, that we can say for sure. But if the general output is like consistently really solid, like its recommendations are rock solid, like maybe they're a reflection of our better self or what we at least believe is our better self, then I think we start abdicating. I'm not trying to be a pessimist here. I'm just saying I suspect many things that we are married to having volitional control over now, we will with shocking abandon leave behind as soon as if we flip the switch, 3 times, and each time is like way better than when we did all this volitional effort that we were all proud of. I think at some point we just leave the switch on for many, many parts of our lives.
That's a good point. So I have 2 things. I think the first one is that actually like the example of kind of social media and tech phones and so on, in my mind, it's actually kind of doesn't push against what I'm saying in the sense that I think a lot of kind of theories around social media have been kind of exaggerated in terms of, shifting voter kind of opinions and that kind of thing. I think people have like more solid kind of like belief systems, and there's generally kind of a selection effect in that they'll seek the information that they want to see in any event. But I think sometimes kind of there's been a bit too much explained by just kind of reference to these larger systems, whether it's phone or social media, Instagram or something. But but that point aside, though, I think for quite a lot of things you want to kind of again remain in the driver's seat. But also, like, I'm right now not kind of deciding on every single micro decision of, how are the roads being built exactly, like what kind of materials are being used for these roads, like, what's the height density, what's the height limit for building, there's loads of decisions that one could be in principle taking individually and collectively, but that we also decided, like, actually we're quite fine delegating that to some experts. So to the extent that you have a world where you can delegate with high trust and confidence to things, then I think it is actually fine for me to be like, okay, well, you know what? I don't really need to think about this particular issue that often, and that's potentially okay. And I don't think this is necessarily a loss of agency. I think this is a different, efficiency optimization kind of thing that isn't necessarily conducive to lots of bad stuff. But you did mention in your original question the risk of, well, what if someone up there, or some person controlling a system realizes, well, I can just use this to kind of fiddle around with things a lot. Well, in that case, I would not use that system. I don't think that system should be around. So I think if, these are all conditional on the development of these tools and systems and structures to be kind of done in a way that does provide the right level of, I vote because in the UK, because I know that my vote will be not kind of like, it will be counted and it's like good process in the background. I can trust that. And I think that does not, that's how I think about these things as well when I think about the wider kind of wilder stuff.
Well, we're getting into the question around sort of what kind of future do you want to arrive at? And one of the things you put in your notes is a future that's resilient, hopefully a future that can allow for these wacky different developments and the ability for there to be undergirded structures for us to make new decisions and maintain some of the things that we find valuable. I think there's a whole nother essay to write, Seb. I got to put this on my list, but sort of, is this abdication of these different processes from groceries to hiring to whatever, does this turn into an elevation of agency? Like, to your point, again, you might vote for who you want to be mayor, but then you don't have to decide on the particular materials that are being used at what thickness for a certain highway, right? That's not your decision, and you're happy with that. Will we elevate agency, or will we, in many regards, fade away agency? I wonder how that'll be different for different people, but I think it's worth chewing on. Regardless, we'll get a little bit into our second to last question here. We're coming to the kind of the home stretch on what sort of future we want to build towards, in terms of AGI and human, end state. Now, there is no end state, but sort of a next plateau we could arrive at where you would say, hey, that worked out pretty well. Where we are now, I actually look around and this is kind of how I would have hoped AGI and humans would sort of get together. What are some of the traits? And again, neither of us have a crystal ball, but you probably have an idea of at least some bad ones you want to avoid and maybe some good ones you want to have. What is that future that would make you feel like we got it right?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. I think one that is often underrated, or at least like underexplored. It's very easy to think through how might things go wrong. And of course, then, but thinking through what is, the right future look like, what is success like here, I think is equally important. And I think, so obviously it goes without saying that I think, avoiding the worst catastrophes, existential risk, loss of human agency, which we just discussed, and I think, negative impacts on democratic governance and so on and so forth. I think that would be a great start already, just like not having all this like really bad stuff. Of course, there's prosaic harms and many things that will still happen, but like you want to reduce that as much as possible. But I think in terms of the positive vision, I think you want to kind of have a world where, a lot of the kind of key fundamental issues we're facing at the moment, for example, like seem solved, right? So like if I think about kind of like animal, welfare, if I think about things like the environment, if I think about, poverty, obviously a lot of these being, significantly improved would be already a great kind of direction to be on. And then, and I think again, in the long run, again, if you think about AGI, ASI or something, ASI, as a protector of humanity or whatever that is, that something like that seems like broadly fine, where people are actually able to do the stuff they want to do, whatever that may be, without really having to be too concerned about kind of survival or warfare or famine, or, that would be already a huge step forward for humanity, given where we are today. And I think that and of course it's very kind of, optimistic and so on.
Yep.
Like, there's no guarantee that this happens, of course, but I'm here. You asked me to describe what was success like.
No, absolutely. Go for it. We're going to pick it apart, but let's hear it. Yeah.
And we should. But I think and I guess I think of it in terms of desirable properties. So the first one is kind of what I've written some notes. Yeah, stable and beneficial coexistence. So, I guess the future where kind of humans, AI systems, AIs, agents, whatever, kind of, there's a nice kind of harmonious, feedback loop type thing going on where, in the same way as I'm with my friends, right? I don't want to fight with them. It's like, it's nice, it's fine, it's good.
Yeah.
The other one is like space for human values to also evolve. I don't think the future should be dictated by a single set of values. I think you want kind of competition between different views and values. And, I think what we think of as good today might not always be the case, in the same way as like,
Absolutely.
I wouldn't want any value from the past being crystallized. And I think similarly, I want kind of culture and the values we kind of hold and think of as good and desirable to also be able to evolve in parallel. And I think it's easy also sometimes to kind of, lock yourself in the world where you just have the same stuff forever. And then growth and exploration, I don't want stagnation. I want people, again, to be able to continue the progress of stuff we've been building, whether it's medicine, bio, anything. And then you mentioned resilience. I think resilience is going to be more meta property of being able to withstand unforeseen challenges, not taking kind of an unnecessary, risk on some things, like, again, the pandemic stuff is the easy example here, but having very strong cybersecurity across the board is something would be a very kind of basic point. But a resilient future with kind of enough defenses against things going wrong seems like a good state to be in overall. Some high
level points here. I'll just clarify like a handful of things, and we'll just. This is the big question, Seb. Right? I mean, at the end of the day, I don't know how much I care about governance. I think I care about better outcomes happening and Armageddon-ish outcomes happening, right? It's like governance is a tool, hopefully, to achieve outcomes. And it's certainly not the only tool. Anyone who thinks it's the only tool is making a very goofy statement. But it's part of a panoply of ways that we could do, ways that we could flex our present agency to maybe have a less likelihood of the extinguishment of humanity and or of Earth life, and maybe a greater likelihood of a beneficial future. And there's all sorts of versions of that. Some of what you brought up was this idea of sort of strong AI potentially as kind of protector of humanity. When you think about sort of a brilliant and sparkling future, would throw a random year out there, 1,000 years from now, I don't know. It could be 100, could be 10,000. I'm not sure it matters, but we'll use 1,000 for fun. Is most of your decision around how well things have gone? So we zoom forward 1,000 years, you're floating in your little uploaded brain cube looking down at Earth through, whatever means you have at that time. Is most of your gauging of kind of this went well to this didn't go well, how many and how happy are the hominids? In other words, there is no more war, there's no more disease. Maybe people can live forever. They still have to maybe trim their toenails or something, but they can, I don't know, they can frolic through gardens of unlimited fruit or whatever idea, right? Is that sort of the bulk of it? Is there also a portion of your assessment of how well things have gone in terms of this grand post-human intelligence sort of what is its sentient experience, and what be it doing sort of outside the realm of bunny rabbits and oak trees, and maybe
Right.
into the broader galaxy. Is there any weight at all on the latter camp for you? We've had different people with very different views. There is no right one. I think it's just interesting it's interesting to garner the thoughts from different thinkers. How are you thinking about positive future there in terms of those two, let's say, receivers of benefits?
I think it's a particularly hard question, but I think certainly I don't think it's just hominids alone or something, or mammals alone. And in general, I would kind of expand my kind of moral circle of concern to something to, I don't know, insects, animals, much more if I could, again, right? Like to the extent that you can avoid harm, I would kind of maximize that. Now, whether, again, future AI systems in that kind of tranche of 1,000 years, at some point develop or we develop something, that's some consciousness, a sense of something. There's loads of, related questions. I think people also sometimes conflate the question A, is it sentient or something? And question B, and therefore what? What are the normative? It might be conscious, it doesn't really matter, or it might be conscious that it deserves a certain type of right or something of that sort.
Yep.
And I think that second question is certainly not clear to me at all, and depends on so many factors. Like, with animals, we look at pain, we look at many other things, but that's not like we've resolved that question for humanity right now.
Absolutely not.
And so I guess my kind of prior, if you like, or my kind of bias, if you like, is that I would be very open to kind of opening up this this circle of moral worth or value to more entities and things, to the extent that this is kind of ultimately desirable or helpful or beneficial. And I had written kind of this piece, this very exploratory piece, like again a little bit like this kind of positive symbiosis thing, and the idea was broadly like, to the extent that you are creating things that are kind of effectively undistinguishable from humans, and having similar functions and kind of acting the same and so on. There's a bunch of different arguments as to why you might want to potentially kind of also at the very least collaborate, or at least explore futures that are kind of mutually beneficial. I don't think it's like a slam dunk. I think there's many reasons to think, well, no, actually you can control the thing pretty well, and you can get super intelligent, highly controlled systems that, and I think that's plausible. But in my mind, again, I'm struggling to predict things in 5 years, let alone 1,000.
Of course.
I do not necessarily see the kind of moral side of the world of the universe that's kind of limited to the kind of creatures that existed on Earth for this particular slice of time. I think you can go a bit wider, but it's all conditional on our survival in the first place as well, or our evolution, or whatever you want to see it.
Yeah, I think that there are some people, so I've mentioned this many times on the trajectory, there's many ists that you are no longer allowed to be. So it wasn't that long ago, Seb, not that long ago, when you could be many ists. I won't say any of them, but certain kinds of IST words where you could be them and you could still hold political office, or, be a publisher of some kind or whatever. Now, a lot of those ists are gone, but speciesist is one you are still allowed to be. And there are many people who are very much in the camp of the eternal hominid kingdom. That is to say, whatever it is that we build, its measure of success, a million years from now, never mind 1,000, is how many and how happy are the Homo sapiens sapiens. And I don't necessarily concur with that belief myself. I think what you're saying is, hey, we'd have to see if this stuff is conscious itself, if it's something that's not just a tool. I think there is potentially a reality where these are super powerful systems, which for some strange reason, it seems evident through our research or other means that there's no light on upstairs. Maybe we don't make the progress in the category of what that light is. It ends up sort of being just a very, very powerful, cell phone or, laptop, at scale doing vastly, that's possible. So you're saying if these things seemed to be to warrant moral concern, then it would make sense on some level to consider that as well, is what you're getting at.
Yeah, and I think again, it's really unclear what that kind of moral concern necessarily leads to or means, right? It's I think Joe Cosmith has some really good essays, I think, on this, a series of 10, 12 essays or something, on otherness. Joe Cosmith. I think they're
Cosmith. Okay, Joe Cosmith.
Carlsmith. Okay. And I think these are really, really good and kind of get to some of these questions in very elegant ways. But I think there's I see a world where, again, you could kind of, I wouldn't, I certainly wouldn't agree with kind of what I sometimes hear of, I don't know them for sure, but Sutton's views of like, whatever happens, if it's, the better, more intelligent system,
Yes. Yep.
like, not that. And I think certainly also not like, oh, it has to absolutely be human with, two legs in that shape or something forever and ever. I guess I'm somewhere in between. And also, and that's the uncertainty, right? It's like, and the other thing is that I was trying to argue in that essay is that like, I don't really think we're going to crack, certainly in the next 5-10 years, like, oh, this is the mathematical formula for consciousness, or saying, this is what it means. And this is, this variable means you get these many rights or something, like, I think it's going to be a lot messier in practice.
Yeah.
And as a result, I was arguing for, okay, other kind of, game theoretical or other types of arguments we could, look at for why collaboration may, in some circumstances, be better. Even, regardless of whether it's conscious or if it's really thinking, whatever, all these kind of questions that are like interesting, but, not necessarily determinative, I think. And so that's something I was trying to explore and think, well, maybe even if it isn't conscious, it might be kind of instances where it makes sense for, just, kind of prisoner's dilemma type thing of just cooperating. But again, I'm no expert here. The thing I want before answering all these questions, like very confidently, is like, again, more work on this kind of stuff, whether
Absolutely.
it's on the, machine, AI welfare. I think Sam Bauman had a good post on AI safety that looked at this stuff. There's interesting stuff out there. I think right now there's a bit more interest in these questions. I particularly liked Murray Shanahan's podcast on machine learning street talk and a few others. I think, really interesting thinking going on here. But again, would be interested in seeing more because I'm just kind of still learning a lot and keen to do more of that.
Yeah, well, you sit, I think, where I guess fingers crossed, where a lot of people would sit, which is, you said, between two poles. So one pole, and Sutton's view is a little bit more nuanced. We have a whole trajectory interview with him, but I get what you mean. I get what you mean. But on some level, he does have a very ardent belief that consciousness will be necessarily the case, and that sort of it would be a worthy successor by definition, like better able to continue. He brings up a very good point, Sutton, and we're going to get to your idea about values in half a second here. But he brings up this idea of, which I hate to say I'm very congenial with, this notion that the universe is kind of a dynamic system as best as we can tell, and it is sort of beckoning life to be or become in whatever best way it can to continue to persist. And sort of, it doesn't stop, right? You can't just, if we paused Earth and said, let's pet all the bunny rabbits and make sure all the roly-poly bugs, get fed with a little dropper of sugar water, right? If we did that for X number of years, volcanoes, other stuff, asteroids, at some point, some other intelligence comes in. Does it care about bunny rabbits? Like the world doesn't stop for our happy-go-friendly hoo-ha. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have any happy-go-friendly hoo-ha. I'm just saying someone is playing with the black pieces, whether it be nature or whether it be other intelligences. And we can't play around as if that's not the case. I think that's a very valid point on Sutton's part. But a part that I do disagree on some level with him is that almost anything that gets bubbled forth at a certain degree of capability is necessarily sort of a worthy successor, sort of a grand proponent. I think there's other people that would say there is no such thing. There are hominids, and there are the children of hominids, and that is the only successor there is, right? And you sit somewhere in the middle, which is, we should figure out what that is, right? And that's my stance. Let us talk ardently about what a worthy successor would be, and how would we be able to detect if we got closer to it or farther. And we had Bostrom on and Sutton on and Yoshua Bach, and Bach's episode isn't live at the time of you and I having this conversation, but a bunch of people try to answer that. But it sounds like you're in that middle ground as well. You bring up values. And you bring up the necessity for values to shift. Presumably, many of those, the value of an average person in the UK in 1122 AD or 1122 BC we would presume be slightly different than yours. I mean, they would still care about, friends and food and other things, but a lot of their values would be different. We might presume some of the things we hold to be normal now, should the future be able to progress, who knows how much time we have, would be seen as abhorrent by some future generation, whether it be eating hamburgers or, whatever the case may be. Would you presume, like, what does it mean for you for values to, I guess, have room to evolve? And I'm going to ask where AGI fits into that in just a bit, but let me just first have you clarify. What does that mean? This sort of is it evolve in the way that they have for the last couple thousand years, or do you see it as different, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, again, tricky question, but I think one way I've been thinking about this is that, at the moment you've got kind of a bunch of kind of large models fine-tuned to be chatbots, and then kind of further fine-tuned to be a particular type of kind of personality or persona. And I think a lot of people then downstream use this kind of, there's this kind of instance of a chatbot or something that has its particular values and kind of things, set up implicitly or explicitly. And my kind of intuition is that I'm not a huge fan of this kind of, top down, here's a bunch of we've broadly decided the kind of personality that is the safest and best for everyone, and everyone kind of gets to use that, and that's it. Whereas I much prefer and enjoy and value kind of the kind of bottom up version of, well, my model is a little bit different from yours, and mine believes these things, and at least I've got these beliefs, so why not the model I'm using? And for that kind of, essentially allowing more user personalization, customization, it also allows, I think, different, conflicting models to come to different kind of conclusions or, inferences. So I think that leads to more kind of richness, diversity, and that also allows more kind of competition in the kind of marketplace of values, if you like, or ideas. So that may be how I see it, but again, with caveats. I think I've tweeted about this, including caveats, but it was something along the lines of, even the harm principle and Mill and all these kind of authors were looking at, okay, there's certain things you can't do because you're encroaching on the freedoms of others. Again, very hard to define, and what is that exactly with models? But as a baseline, I think we still have some scope to kind of enable a bit more diversity and kind of craziness with the models without going in dangerous territory.
Yeah, I'd concur. I mean, I think most people tuned in probably would say being able to kind of swim in values and allow them to evolve. Presumably, a lot of them have evolved in response to what behooves us as humans, right? There was a time, Seb, where having the value of if you're a male, learning to throw a spear is numero uno and your moral worth should hinge on it.
Yeah.
I'm not going to play any games with you, Seb. That probably made a lot of sense for a hot minute. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. That probably made a lot of sense, actually, for a hot minute. And then there was a time where actually that as your main value was really just less useful. Like there were less enemies at the gates. You got your food from some means other than throwing a spear at a boar. And like doing other stuff made a lot more sense. So presumably there will be new circumstances, new values. What comes to mind sometimes for me, Seb, is you and I, presumably, have values that have a good deal more breadth and the opportunity for more breadth and depth than, let's say, the values of a Labrador retriever. While a Labrador could understand that you are playing with it, while Labrador could understand maybe that you care for it or you're disappointed in it, or maybe a Labrador even understands fairness on some tertiary level, right? How much food do you give to different animals, whatever the case may be. Presumably you couldn't share, those essays of Mill that you were just referring to with the Labrador, or discuss the different means of intergovernmental policy that you and I have talked about in this discussion, or even shown it a good painting by Jerome or a good poem by Emerson. It just wouldn't go very far. We have a wider range of values. I can't speak for you. I personally am glad that I have a wider range of values than a Labrador. Mm-hmm. That's me personally. One might suspect, and I don't know for sure, but presuming we come up with something more advanced than a toaster oven. So a toaster oven would mean, we push the button and it makes toast. If AGI is that, we don't have this concern. But presuming that we have systems with vastly more cognitive firepower than we have, maybe senses, physical senses that you and I don't have, infrared, all kinds of things we can't imagine maybe. I mean, whatever you can do with a sensor. I mean, we've only got 5.5 or whatever. Access to all current information, the ability to make scientific breakthroughs wherever it wants to apply a minute amount of focus. It might even be like a millionth of its focus in a dark corner. It could just start smashing its way through parts of mathematics or biology with its focus. Presumably we get to something very, very capable. We might presume that its breadth of ways of valuing things and ways of deciding would be maybe equally incomprehensible to us as ours are to Labradors, but also maybe better. I mean, we do things with dogs that they don't understand because two reasons, both of which are maybe, a little bit tough. One of them is just like, we know better. Like, hey, dog, there's a hurricane coming in Florida. I'm sorry. I'm putting you in the car. You don't like being in the car. I'm sorry, bud. We're going. I can't explain hurricane. You're a damn dog. But I'm putting you in the car and you're going, pal. Or I'm giving you this pill. I'm wrapping it in bacon. You have parasites. You don't want to die from these parasites, dog. I know you don't like to taste the pill, but like, shut up for a minute. So there's a knowing better than it. And then there are other decisions where we are simply more important pound for pound than a dog. So like in situations where everyone's starving, the dog's going to get eaten before a person is. And I'm not saying AI will eat us. I'm just saying there is a relatively acknowledged understanding that we are of a higher potentia than an individual dog and also like maybe a higher moral standing. Would you presume that these same kind of considerations would happen with AI? Because I sort of wonder how much of a consortium of value discussions are we having with lower entities today? And do we presume that when we're swimming in higher capability entities, they will entertain such discourse with us? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, well, I think, there's so many different parts to this I'd love to kind of unpack, but it's going to be impossible because I can't hold them in my hand at the same time. So I'll try a few, but I think so. The first thing is, I think in the dog in the hurricane example or something, I think, if you were the dog and if you had all knowledge, if you could have had that knowledge, you'd probably select and choose for the human to save you from the hurricane. And similarly, when I'm in an elevator and I don't understand its design at all, I don't know what's going on in the elevator. I can't like reverse engineer it. I can't do anything. I mean, probably if I could spend like a few years or something, I would. But like, I don't. I just trust kind of. I externally I trusted like some kind of experts that I think know what they're doing and have been kind of, brought to the world to do their work in such a way that will lead to my safety or something. And I kind of like trust what's going on there. And I think this is fine. And I think similarly, I think you could imagine situations where like, well, a particular recommendation or kind of system it's recommended by that, AGI system or ASI system would be that beneficial for me. And I don't necessarily kind of get it straight away. To the extent that I can verify it and can check it, I think that's something that would probably kind of, and again, I'm not going to do it individually with every single micro decision, but I know that if I use a bunch of other AI models or something, I can kind of try to like unpack everything and unfurl, stuff to a degree that I could actually understand it, even if it takes like 10 years of my life. I think, in these situations, I think I'm more comfortable with like, trusting the system, but the system has to be trustworthy to start with. So that's in the first kind of category of questions of like how to. For the second one of, but worst comes to worst, if it's between the dog and I or something, yes, I will not sacrifice myself to the dog or something. Or like there is a hierarchy of kind of moral worth and concern. I don't really know whether a super intelligent system might actually find a mutually beneficial, a kind of like non-zero sum thinking kind of approach to this stuff. Like, well, it doesn't really even matter what, there's ways around that. Or it turns out with all of its, super intelligent kind of prowess and capabilities and access to the universe and everything, it has no choice but to like, harm the humans in the process of that one specific way. And that could be theoretically the case. But I've got an intuition also, and this is not knowledge or a fact or anything like that, but an intuition that like, I'm not sure to what extent, again, like, I guess intelligence and what is somewhat of a moral good or something completely orthogonal. Again, I'm really not certain about this. So I can see the many ways that you can apply loads of intelligence to harm or misuse of something or something really good. That makes sense. But I also, even us, when you look at, you're using the example analogies of dogs, we seem to be less kind of, I think, aggressive to dogs than we might be to kind of bugs or something. Again, I don't know how much I want to extrapolate from that. And I think this whole
yeah. Some of the I was going to say some of these words, you eating some of these might not be a good taste,
Well,
but
actually,
I'm following you. I'm following you.
It's a good point, but I think even then, like I think like it's only in the last 50 years that we become a lot more capable as a species that we're thinking through. Maybe we shouldn't be killing thousands of chickens a day and torturing kind of like cows and so on. A lot more than we did 500 or 1,000 years ago. And so one thing that has changed in that time frame is progress on kind of our moral concerns and also human capabilities more like wildly. So I think that with increased capabilities and better kind of intelligent cognition and all these things, you can also find ways or at least I think / hope that you can find ways of catering to these problems, even kind of moral concern problems. I think you can reason with around morality as well. That I think could reduce some of these risks. But of course, like I can't tell you right now. If you press the button, you get a super intelligent. What happens? Like obviously no one can. And I can imagine a world where like that thing has like no if it is even a thing, concern or respect for human life on a moral level. So yeah, that's imaginable. I just don't know for sure whether it's inevitable or like median outcome, I guess. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I think any statement of absolute certainty would be tough.
Sure.
My supposition is that morality is part of the set of capabilities that social, particularly mammals, have that allow us to survive, and it is a subset of that, as opposed to part of the ether of either the universe or the nature of intelligence itself. But with all that said, time will tell, and we don't know. It does seem, if someone were to posit the consideration, like, Seb, it dawns on me, like, we can all look down and say, yes, we're a more advanced species, let's torture less chickens. Surely something much more intelligent than us would treat us well. And you're not saying surely, which I'm grateful for. We hear a lot of surelys from very, very smart and eminent people here on the show, Seb. I hear a lot more surely than you would think I would. Like very eternal iron certainty, like the same likelihood that if I, drop my phone, it's going to fall. Like the same likelihood about the moral behavior of posthuman intelligence. That's why I have multiple interviews, because I always want to counter any of those black and whites. But let's just say someone were to posit the notion, Seb, as a human, I am doing things, and I could talk about sea snails where the example would be even more extreme, but let's use Labradors for now. I'm doing things, whether it's building a business, interacting with my neighbors, thinking about international governance, trying to invent some device in the pharmaceutical field, whatever the case may be. I'm aiming to occupy Mars so that if something happened with Earth, there'd be a backup of humans or whatever. I'm just listing random goals, any one of which is essentially inconceivable to this animal, and that when I was pursuing it, it would be hard to imagine trying to explain, or why would it matter? And we could imagine that an entity that initially bootstrapped off of us, so kind of would be grounded in some of our stuff, but an entity with outlandishly more intelligence would just come up with goals so much different than ours, and maybe so much. I mean, I hate to say better. Are your goals better than a Labrador? I don't know, man. If it's international policy, I think they're probably better. I want you making the decisions more than if it was you and a dog. Even sure. You and most people, I'd say. Does it seem realistic that it would emerge at goals and say like maybe it's okay? Well, we can just moral value. It's sentient, blissful, positive qualia. Let's say Stuart Mill was right. Ooh, the AGI agrees with Mill. Yeah. If it can start to turn a cluster of atoms, this big, properly machined at a nano level or femto level or whatever you want to do, into more positive qualia than all current Earth life, or the current Earth life on, let's say, individual continent, like, Africa or America or what have you, we might imagine maybe it would pursue that. Or if it better thought we should live in a simulation, maybe it would. Or if its entire mandate was avoiding the heat death of the universe, or some risk that we can't conceive of that is much farther beyond the heat death of the universe, then it would allocate all of its resources to that. And maybe with no malice to humans, I've awakened and I hate humans. It would just awaken and pursue things that are important at levels we don't understand. Would you consider this a realistic concern for us being fading into the background, or would you say, hey, Dan, I don't think that would happen? Because you have a lot of these ideas about this kind of symbiosis, and I'm sort of presenting a notion against that, but I'd love your thoughts.
But I certainly, how realistic. I think that it's as realistic as any of the other scenarios they've come up with about ASI almost. So I think in terms of, is it plausible? Yes. Like, I think, I could imagine a world where, like, for whatever reason, or even, you prompted, whatever reason, like, things go wrong really, really badly. I think this kind of like hyper consequentialist type kind of like ASI is a possibility. But I don't think it's necessarily the median. And also, like, who, I guess one question I would have also is, like, who gives it the goals? Is it like, why does it develop natural random goals at some point? And why are these not kind of anchored to anything that's been happening in the past? Does it just kind of develop some sort of independent kind of break-off chain thing? I was like, okay, none of this matters anymore. I'm this new thing now. And I can imagine a lot of that. But I think it's very hard to kind of like, I can imagine many things, but like the the going from AGI to ASI, I think it will look different than probably like what we kind of imagine of it being a very, very fast thing into like now we don't know. And I think that part of the role of governance and everything else is like building, again, when I mean systems, tools and everything, I do mean kind of, again, law structure and everything. And when I mean somebody else says these systems are part of these tools and systems, so it's kind of like almost like baked in. I don't know. I don't know if it necessarily like means that, oh, we're safe or we're not safe or anything, but I just think of it very difficult to think of it. Yeah, potentially I can think of a a species, a god or something that kind of has, that makes sense to me. It's just that it's harder to make a positive claim about this being kind of the average or median or likely outcome.
Totally. Well, a couple important things you bring up. One of them is, when does this become untethered? I mean, clearly right now, AI is being used in very banal ways in the enterprise. It's being used to, write essays for people or social media posts or whatnot. At what point does this bubble up into this grand thinking agentic thing? I think that's a worthwhile point. And to your point, one thing I will say is I'm not 1,000% sure that what I just articulated is going wrong. I think there is potentially a world where such a thing would be so morally worthy that it ought to do what it do. Also, there could be a world where it fully understands. Like, I think it's just somewhat reasonable where humans would insist, I must live in the world of atoms. This is where I'm happy. I like, mosquitoes, and it would just be like, yeah. And then it would just upload you because like, you're clearly going to be happier without some of these physical dangers and with like a constant gradient of bliss because you're not limited to the current hardware, software. And like, it would just be like, yeah, that I'm sure that's best for you. And then it would just, just like with the dog, it would just be like, it would wrap the medicine and it would just be like, boop,
yep.
And it would just give you the damn medicine.
So in principle, yeah. I think there's this very same scenario. There's a world where I would be highly opposed to it. There's a world where I'm highly, I would be okay with that happening. And that's like conditional on variables that I don't necessarily all know about. So it's like, yeah, like I was happy my mom gave me like medicine without me realizing something when I was a child.
Yes.
And I would not be happy if some random stranger in the street did the same thing. And I think similarly, I guess, like, there will be a condition where like, okay, well, if for whatever reason I get to escape, like imminent catastrophe by uploading, then all right, if the alternative is I die and then the next day, then potentially like that is worthwhile. If, however, it turns out to be just kind of, on some unscrutinizable set of like principles that I can't ever understand, it's just, well, maybe not, so there's a lot of dependencies involved in imagining that I think need to be like unpacked more. And so, yeah, I can totally describe both a world where I'm okay with that decision and really not okay with it. I'm just always escaping with my
I like how consistently nuancedly gray your responses are in a way that is frank, right? It's not banally gray like in just vagaries. It's sort of like, there's always a sort of, this isn't always bad, this isn't always good, there's always conditions here. And I think there's an essay to be written that I'll have to, we'll have to tweet about it at some point, around sort of in the grand panoply of possibilities, what are more likely. I think I'm a little bit more in the camp than you are, that of the unlimited ways that such a thing could value, once it gets to a certain scale, there's kind of a sliver of those over time as it keeps fooming, right? Our values are different now than we were Homo erectus or than when we were chimpanzees, right? So as it keeps fooming, right, we're 97% the same genetics as a chimpanzee. So this thing is fooming way more than we did through kind of the ape strata here. There's a sliver where there's a thread of like always still friendly to humans, sort of, that we could follow as like a light cone possibility. Like there's a couple paths that are like eternally friendly, but I suspect most have things to do with things that aren't us. But it may be the case that there are good arguments that a lot of those light cone paths are actually great for us, and that's giving me ideas of what more to chew on. But I want to make sure we can wrap up on time here, Seb. So I'm gonna close out on our final question, which is kind of more of a nutshell. This is around what should be happening now to eventually arrive at potentially the kind of governance we will need when we cross that chasm. The thing that I know for sure from this conversation and from previous interactions with you is, the monitoring of those things that you had discussed, the general risks, the degree of kind of its autonomy and agency, capabilities. This is something we should kind of stay attuned to and be talking about more ardently. What are the other things? Again, not governance. This guy, for you, and in your case, it's kind of more of the pre-governance steps. What are the other things you hope are happening? Conversations should be happening, things governments might be doing, things you hope the startup innovation ecosystem does. What are some of the things that if you saw more of it today, you'd say, you know what? I think we'll get governance right when we get there. What are some of those things that would give you hope in that direction?
Typically, I think governance is happening. We're doing governance. I just think like law specifically, or like a big international institution.
Totally. Yeah. We should draw that line. You're right.
But so I do think governance is extremely important, and it's kind of what the field I'm working in, and what. So I think this is ongoing and will continue evolving and shaping. But what is necessary for me right now, I think, at a macro scale, or like, I don't know which kind of level of abstraction to start with. But I think the first thing I'd say actually is that, like, I think there's a lot of utility in different kind of professions, experts, and so on out there, whether it's in economics or other fields that I think is really useful knowledge, but a lot of these people haven't necessarily kind of like, felt the AGI. And I think that it would be desirable. I don't think, for them to just fall into some sort of big kind of, hypey thing of like, oh, that's it. And, but I think to also, think through their work and account for, what if, this could be true? What if indeed, like, you get these capabilities in the next 3 years? What does that change about my thinking now? What does that change about kind of the work I'm doing on, modeling this thing and this and that thing? What are that, I think kind of accounting for AGI as a possibility in the next 10 years does help you kind of shape your thinking in different ways and allow a little bit more creative thinking than you otherwise can. I think that's like a nice, helpful thing overall to, that I would sprinkle around. More concretely, though, I think, there's the usual stuff of like, you need a better science of evaluations. Like, I suspect that we're, evaluation is something that people didn't talk about for long, and sometimes it's a little bit overrated. But overall, I think it's going to be very useful having loads and loads of different types of tests that you can run at scale on models in automated ways and kind of, help with that whole process of kind of safety as well. So I want like more work on that side of things. And you've got places like Meteor, that's evals. For which ones Rand, a bunch of others, Apollo doing, I think, which is very good. I like to look more unpacking on, what does automation of machine learning R&D mean and look like in practice? Like, how do you disentangle necessary capabilities and what that looks like? You've also actually, there's a whole Leopold essay from a the situational awareness essay that was, I think, quite a good piece out. Again, I don't agree with everything, but I think that this kind of like thinking is useful for it to be out there. And I like more thought on, should a project or anything like that ever be required? What does it look like? What does it not look like? How do we evaluate all this kind of stuff? What's the civilian side of things? There's like weird stuff that I usually kind of like finding on Twitter or whatever. But like I think that the stuff like machine psychology I think is interesting. I think there's more people kind of trying to like work out now like what are behavioral patterns, emergent abilities, or mechanisms of decision making that these kind of systems have, and does that offer you any further tools as you might have with humans for kind of aligning in different ways? Obviously Janus is the name that comes to mind, but a bunch of people doing weird experiments out there that do sometimes come up with like interesting, not completely crazy insights.
How do we spell Janus again, just for people to kind of Google?
I think the username on Twitter is Repligate, Repligate.
Oh yeah. Okay, this crowd. Yeah. Fully. Yep.
Yeah, fully. Yeah. But I think there's some
really experimental stuff.
Yeah, I like experimental stuff. If
it's
people
cool.
trying to fix out there, it might even if 99% of the time it just gives you like cool art or nothing like too like useful. I think that does enable other stuff in parallel sometimes.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I think I'd like more thinking, I guess, or more like elaboration of how do we think through the alignment problem now in light of what we know now about kind of models, about mitigation techniques, about weights, about kind of represent what's it called again? Like representation engineering, all these kind of things. Like what progress have we made technically that allows us to kind of have a slightly more concrete talking points, or like threat models about how alignment or misalignment should be conceived of theoretically, as an update from like how people might have been thinking about it like 5 years ago or something. I'm just going on with random ideas here, but
no. So
that stuff would be good.
Two major themes are coming to the fore, and I want to see if this is a good nutshelling of your answer of the things that would, make you feel all the more optimistic that we'll sort of continue to build governance bricks that, writ large, give us the best shot at a better future. One of them that you mentioned off the bat, if I'm congealing it properly, was it might be useful to get, your hope is that more people with different sorts of backgrounds, whether it be economics or what have you, feel the AGI, so to speak, and start joining this conversation. It's crazy to think it was like a year and a half ago when Bengio wasn't feeling the AGI. Certainly the first time I interviewed him, he was feeling no AGI whatsoever. So if it took Bengio that long, who knows how long it'll take some, professor of economics at University of Michigan. But either way, we can presume more and more. We are seeing more and more people jump in the conversation. Sounds like for you, more people with different types of backgrounds and expertise being able to be weaved in, having hot takes about what the implications could be in different corners and how those connect to the other hypotheses and essays being put forth. It sounds like you think that would be a net good. The encouragement of that would be a net good. And then similarly, more kind of diving into capabilities. What does it look like for systems to be self-improving, and how can we measure how well they're doing that? What does it look like to understand what's undergirding the behavior of models, this ideas of kind of machine psychology, things along those lines. It seems broadly that there's two camps. There's sort of like, let's get some more good voices in the room and get some more good ideas on the table. And then also, let's pay closer attention to where the capability space is creeping and crawling. Is that safe to say that these are kind of the two bigger items you'd want to put on the table here, or is there anything I'm missing?
I think the two items. I'm sure I could come up with like infinite stuff.
50 of them. Yes. I'm just trying to cluster them for the audience. Yes.
But But I think certainly, the first one makes sense. Like, I think the example that popped in my mind when I was thinking about the first one was like economists who used to do agent-based modeling, quickly realizing this was not a very useful way of doing economics. And now actually with new tools, you can potentially do more. So you should re-explore some of these kind of past conceptions. And the second one, is the science of kind of understanding, testing, evaluating models more generally. Like, and this to me is a little bit like, 10, 15, 20 years ago, whatever, even before, of course, like all these debates around kind of impact evaluation, RCTs, and, like what's the gold standard? How do you test for something? I think you're going to similarly develop much better methodologies and a bit of science of, again, testing and understanding models in a way that gives you more confidence in what you're testing and the result you're seeing. And so I think that would be, another bucket that is, a big one here. And then what else? I mean, I think, we started off the conversation with stuff around international governance again. Still think you need more research and thinking in that space. Still think you need better kind of like consideration of foreign policy, of where capabilities are going, the sequencing of this stuff, how to use AI for wider societal good and everything. I think that's stuff I'd like to see more of. And maybe to finish off your point of, what's the positive future we're imagining? I'd like more people to kind of, do that, right? Like, explain what should we be aiming for, as well as, what should we be avoiding? Like, I think there's like different types of people who will be good at these types of questions, and more of that would be also desirable, I think.
Absolutely. Well, I'm trying to coax out a little bit of that myself here, Seb, and you are one of the guinea pigs for that conversation. So
don't over-index on my own.
Trying to keep that torch lit. Really, really happy we got to go as deep as we did here today, Seb. It's been a real pleasure getting a sense of your nuanced ideas and being able to share that with the audience. So thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So that's all for this first episode in our AGI Governance series. Like our other series, this one will have 5 or 6 episodes in total, and we bring a bunch of different perspectives in our upcoming episodes. I hope you enjoyed this first one with Sebastien. I recommend checking him out on Twitter. Again, he and I have some great exchanges there, and it was fun to be able to unpack in a much deeper format here. He did a lot of prep and notes and really compiled his ideas in a way that was great and made for a good conversation. I hope you've benefited from this one. Our next conversation in this series is with a man who once ran the Defense Innovation Unit for the U.S. DoD and was CEO of one of the U.S.'s most prominent cybersecurity firms. You'll have to find out who I'm speaking about in our next episode in about 2 weeks here on The Trajectory. But you're going to get a very different take, not so much on AGI monitoring, but more on Western versus Chinese supremacy over increasingly strong AI into the future. So stay tuned in the week ahead, and we'll keep rolling here on our AGI Governance series on The Trajectory.